Ancient Egyptian religion. Anyone who's tried to study ancient Egyptian religion runs into a number of obstacles. For one thing, much of the textual and archaeological evidence informing us about ancient Egyptian religion is fragmentary or poorly preserved. Second, most of the surviving texts make only passing references to important religious beliefs or practices. Egyptologists would have loved it if some further context or explanations had been given, but the authors of these texts always seem to have assumed that the reader would understand what is being said. Now, if you've ever tried to write something, you'll know how important it is to know your audience. You can't just assume that your readers are going to know everything that's going on in your head. Sometimes you have to contextualize or explain things to them. Well, that never happens in ancient Egyptian texts. The authors just assume that you'll know exactly what they're talking about. So if you look, for example, at the pyramid texts online, see here at this link, you'll probably find a lot of things that are said that make absolutely no sense to you. But hopefully, by the end of these lectures, you'll at least have a somewhat better ability to make sense of these texts. Okay, a third difficulty in studying ancient Egyptian religion is that although many ancient Egyptian texts and artifacts survive, they rarely present Egyptian beliefs in a systematic or an organized way. Because of this, it's often very difficult to know how the rituals all fit together with one another. Now, you might contrast Egyptian texts in this respect with some of the texts of Hinduism or Judaism. These two religions have books that go into elaborate detail about how the various religious rituals are to be performed and what these rituals mean. They also contain entire legal or moral codes and talk a great deal about the theology and the general belief system that's being advocated by the religion. Not so in ancient Egyptian religion. The beliefs of the ancient Egyptians were apparently passed on through the normal cultural ways, from parents to children, from teachers to their students, and so on. But you're not going to find some ancient book where all the ancient Egyptian religious beliefs and practices are carefully laid out for you. It's really up to us as modern readers to put the evidence together into some systematic way. And because of that, there's a lot of guesswork and speculation that's involved in the study of ancient Egyptian religion. Okay, so here's an example of what I mean when I talk about the lack of context. I'll just read this for you. This is from one of the pyramid texts. He goes who goes with his ka. Horus goes with his ka. Seth goes with his ka. Thoth goes. To say 4 times, he goes who goes with his ka. Horus goes with his ka. Seth goes with his ka. Thoth goes with his ka. The god goes with his ka. He with 2 eyes goes with his ka. You yourself also go with your ka. O Unas, the arm of your ka is before you. O Unas, the arm of your ka is behind you. O Unas, the leg of your ka is before you. O Unas, the leg of your ka is behind you. Osiris Unas, I give you the eye of Horus, that your face may be adorned with it, that the perfume of the eye of Horus may spread towards you. Now, what on earth does all that mean? What is a ka? What is all this business about the ka going before you and all the rest? Well, you need to know what a ka is, and we'll talk about that later. But you can see from this text, I mean, if you sat down and tried to read the pyramid texts, a lot of it would be undecipherable, even though it's been translated into English. And so over the years, Egyptologists have tried to put all this together. And so we're working now with their construct of what it all means. Okay, now it's important to understand a little bit about Egyptian history. We're going back very far in human history. This is one of the earliest civilizations known to man. So starting back really in the dynastic period is where we start. This is dating to the 2600s BC. And that's about the time, supposedly, that the Egyptian pyramids, the main ones at Giza, were constructed. And that period is known as the Old Kingdom period. Okay, now I don't really expect you to know all of these periods here, but just to give you a rough idea of what time frame we're dealing with, I just wanted you to know that that's about when the Old Kingdom starts. And then that's going to extend into the Greco-Roman period. That's when Alexander the Great conquered Egypt. So this is the time frame that we're dealing with, from about 2600 BC to about 322 BC. So it's a lot of time, and a lot of things happen, of course, within that period. Right, well, when people think of the Egyptians, they one of the first things they think about are the pyramids. The most famous pyramids, and some of the oldest ones, certainly the oldest ones that are as large as they are, were built at Giza during the Old Kingdom period. And if you look at some of these pictures here, you can get a sense for the scale of these pyramids. Just look how large each individual stone is. And these stones were very carefully carved such that each one fit almost perfectly on top of the other. Now, the pyramids have been the subject of much study and even more speculation. People have tried to explain how these massive structures were built and what their significance was. Since the stones are so massive, it's an ongoing mystery as to how exactly they were piled up on top of one another. Egypt would have had a large population of slaves, no doubt, so presumably, by means of sheer brute force, along with the help of poles, wedges, and pulleys, these slaves were able to move the stones into place. Now, what exactly the pyramids meant is even more debatable. Aside from their obvious function as monuments to honor the dead pharaohs, whose crypts were encased beneath the structure, the pyramids may have served an astrological function. I'm not well enough informed about those things to really know one way or the other whether it's true, but feel free to look into it yourself if you like. Others have suggested that the pyramids were seen as kind of like launch pads for the souls of the pharaohs as they burst forth from the underworld into the sky in the form of the sun. We seem to be able to trace how the pyramid structure evolved over time. The Egyptians didn't always construct pyramids over the corpses of their deceased leaders. In pre-dynastic times, there were tribal leaders and such, maybe minor kings, but there weren't these larger-than-life pharaohs that governed all of Egypt. Those kinds of figures didn't really emerge until the dynastic periods. And so there's nothing quite as elaborate as we find later on. In the pre-dynastic times, the Egyptians seem to have simply buried their dead. And you can see some examples here from exhibits. This was probably how they were placed inside their graves. Notice that they were buried with various vessels and other accessories. They apparently thought that such items would be useful to them in the afterlife. Well, at some point, the Egyptians began erecting what was called a mastaba over their deceased leaders. A mastaba was a rectangular monument structure with its outside walls angled inward in a sharp slope. Underneath it, there would have been a long shaft that led to the burial chamber, or the crypt. That's where the kings and nobles who had died were buried, along with many of their possessions. The mythological significance of the mastaba is perhaps to be found in an early Egyptian creation myth. According to that myth, before there were any gods or creatures, there was just a primeval sea, which is associated with the god Nun. Then, from that sea, emerged a mound of earth, sometimes referred to as a benben, or identified with the god Tatenen, who was a kind of divine representation of this primeval mound of earth. And by the way, this whole myth about a mound of earth emerging from the primeval sea originated in Lower Egypt, in a region of the Nile Delta, where mounds of earth were being continuously formed through the deposition of river sediment. The Egyptians interpreted this deposition of sediment as a symbol of how the material world came into existence. The god Tatenen was identified as the sun god Atum, or Khnum or Ptah, depending on the region. Tatenen was envisaged as a self-generated deity because that's how it seemed that these mounds of sediment were coming into existence, just through a kind of self-generation. So in the primeval period, when the original mound of earth emerged from the primeval sea, the god Atum, or some other god, appeared and began his work of creation. So one of the scholarly conjectures is that the mastaba was meant to recall this ancient creation myth. Okay, now, what do you think would happen if you erected a giant monument over a crypt of a wealthy ruler? Eventually, people would figure out that there's a lot of wealth down there inside the crypt, and so they would break into it and loot all of the wealth that's buried inside. The pharaoh Kasekemwe, who reigned from the early 27th century BC, anticipated this So he ordered that huge walled enclosures be built around his mastaba at Abydos, as you can see here. And here's some other pictures of these enclosures. And here you can see from this aerial photo from Saqqara what these enclosures would have looked like from above. You might think of them as giant stone fences that were built to keep the looters out. Kasekemwe also diverted state funds in order to construct a royal mortuary complex so that offerings could be made to and for him after he died. And this was a pretty important move, I think. Kasekemwe's reforms suggest a theological shift in ancient Egypt. Religion would now be designed largely to help the pharaoh succeed in the afterlife. Religion, you see, shouldn't just be about you. That's selfish. It should be about the pharaoh and keeping him safe in the afterlife. So Kasekemwe designed a new mortuary cult, a funerary cult, in other words, with offerings and rituals that would be performed on behalf of the dead pharaoh. Well, the enclosure idea was a good one, but it raised a new problem. When you construct a monument, you want it to be seen, right? But people can't see it if it's obscured by massive stone enclosures. So something needed to be done now to make the stone monument more visible. The Egyptians were, of course, limited architecturally with what they could do. They couldn't really build straight up the way that we do now with like skyscrapers and such, because they were building things out of stone and wood and other similar materials that would either get too heavy or collapse if you built them up too high. So another approach was to build in as you built up, making the upper levels successfully smaller than the lower ones. And as they began to heighten these mastabas, they created what we would now call a step pyramid. It was basically one smaller mastaba placed upon a larger mastaba. And so during the third dynasty of the Old Kingdom, the pharaoh Djoser, who lived in the 2600s BC, constructed the first step pyramid. And this would later be developed into the smooth pyramid, which would have its steps filled in with polished limestone. In this photo, you can see one of the smooth pyramids from Giza. Note that the limestone casing has been almost totally removed, looted, over the years, and so now all that's left is the casing at the very tip. Originally, though, they would have looked like this, a nice, shimmering white pyramid of limestone. It must have been quite a sight to behold. Here's a map of some of the places that I've been talking about. Here's Giza, and here's Saqqara. By the way, this photo here you can see with the guy's shoes hanging down. This was a tourist from Germany, I believe, who decided to climb up one of these pyramids and take some photos. Well, of course, you're not allowed to do that. It's against the law in Egypt to climb these pyramids. But he did it, and he took some great photos, so kudos to him for that. But I think his passport was revoked afterwards, so that's a shame. All right, now I want to mention something, too, about these pyramids that you find in the Meso-Americas. A lot of people have conjectured that maybe the pattern for the pyramids in Egypt was somehow brought over to the Americas and that they built these structures on that basis. So here are some of the structures, as you can see, and they go back very far in history, some of them to hundreds of years BC, in fact, even 1,000 years BC in one case. And they are quite impressive structures, to be sure. Here is the Pyramid of the Sun. And the largest of the pyramids, in fact, the largest pyramid in the world, is the Great Pyramid of Kaluwa, which is not as tall as the tallest pyramid in Egypt, but it is larger in terms of its volume. It measures about 1,000 feet square. It's not quite square, but it's around 1,000 feet on each side. The Great Pyramid at Giza, by way of comparison, is 756 feet square. Now, the pyramid at Kaluwa was built not of limestone, as in Egypt, but of adobe brick. As a side note, when the Spanish conquistadors saw that this pyramid at Kaluwa was held in high esteem by the natives, and that they revered it because of the goddess of the 9 rains, they decided to construct a church on top of this site and dedicate it to the Virgin Mary. That way, the people could just redirect their religious affections for the rain goddess toward the Virgin Mary. The apparent assumption behind this kind of evangelistic strategy was that the native population would be easier to convert if they were allowed to retain their older shrines and many of their older practices, but just change up a few names and maybe get them to sit through a Latin Mass on Sundays. Nobody really knew what was being said during Mass anyway, so yeah, I imagine it's a lot easier to convert people if you do it like that. Of course, then it's tough to know whether people are genuinely converting to Christianity or whether they're just adopting and adapting Christian elements into their older system, maybe because of peer pressure or just through some kind of unconscious social drift, and embracing a new system that is neither Christian nor indigenous, but really a new religion altogether. All right, and then here is a computer-generated model of the Pyramid of the Sun, so you can kind of get a sense for what it looked like. Well, what about this question then about the connection between the Egyptian pyramids and the Middle American pyramids? I don't believe that the Egyptians took a boat over to the Americas and instructed them on how to build their pyramids and all that. I think rather that the connection is just coincidental. Think about this. If you're going to build something, some kind of living structure, then you only have so many geometrical designs that you can work with. You've got squares, triangles, circles, right? Now, if you try to build something with a triangle, you can build a tent-like structure where it's got the three sides, but you're not maximizing your living space because the inner walls are slanted inward. What about a circle? Well, you could build a circle straight up and create a cylinder, but those are pretty difficult to construct. And again, you're not maximizing the volume. So if you're going to build something, it's probably going to be a square or a rectangle or some kind of polygon that is based on one of those two geometrical shapes. Now, in the ancient world, if you wanted to build your square or rectangular structure up, you couldn't just build straight up for reasons that I've already mentioned. Instead, you'll build in and up. And once you've added 2 levels to your original floor plan, you've already constructed a step pyramid. So the pyramid structure is not all that complicated to make. So it's really not too surprising that we would have at least 2 parts of the world where these things would turn up. Now, I do think there were connections between the different Middle American peoples and their pyramids. They probably saw each other making them, and so they created some themselves based on what they had seen. Okay, so the design itself is not terribly unique, such that we have to posit some kind of cultural connection between these 2 civilizations. Secondly, if you'll notice, the structures are not exactly the same. The pyramids in the Middle Americas were, you might say, step pyramids, and you did have some step pyramids in Egypt, but they were developed into the true pyramids, right, where they're smooth pyramids. You don't really see that development in the Middle Americas. Thirdly, the pyramids in Egypt come to a point. There's nothing happening up there. By contrast, the Meso-American pyramids had a flat top where they would construct an altar. And so the whole purpose of these pyramids was different. The Meso-American pyramids were lofty altars, these altars set way up high, whereas the pyramids in Egypt served a different function. We don't necessarily know what that function was, but they don't seem to have functioned as altars. So that's another difference. And then you can see also that in order to have these altars at the top, you need steps leading up to the altar. So that's something that you don't find on the Egyptian pyramids. So there are structural design differences too between the Mesoamerican pyramids and the Egyptian pyramids. So my view is that whatever parallels we might be able to draw between the pyramids of Mesoamerica and the pyramids of Egypt, the parallels are purely coincidental. And I don't think we can postulate some kind of cultural connection between the Egyptians and the peoples of the Middle Americas. Okay, with each of the religions that we study, I'm going to put a lot of emphasis on the primary sources. These are the fountainheads, the sources that gave rise to the religion, or the sources that were written or created by the people that we're trying to study. So, for example, if we're talking about Christianity, we're going to go back to the Old and the New Testaments, or perhaps some of the early church fathers, or the early creeds and confessions. If we're talking about Islam, it's not going to be the Bible, it's going to be the Quran. If we're talking about Hinduism, it's going to be the Vedas, the Brahmanas, the Upanishads, and some of the other traditions. You need to understand the difference between primary and secondary sources when it comes to the study of religion. Secondary sources would be like books written today by people about the Bible or about the Quran or about the Egyptian pyramid texts or the Book of the Dead or whatever. Okay, so with regard to Egyptian religion, there is, of course, a lot of text that has been preserved over the years. We've got the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, various papyrus texts, and then we've got the iconography. These are the drawings, the sculptures, the paintings, and so on that we have, which are not texts per se, but they are pictures that can also inform us about what was going on in the religions. And that's another primary source for us. Artifacts are important as well. I'm kind of lumping them in with iconography. Things like amulets and crowns and altars and things of that nature. And then lastly, we have classical authors from the Greek and the Roman civilizations, which often tell us about Egyptian beliefs. So we'll look at each of these real fast. But before I do, I want to talk about the Rosetta Stone, which was the key to translating a lot of these ancient hieroglyphic texts. And the reason it was the key was because it was this ancient monument that was written in 3 different languages: Greek, Demotic, which is a later Egyptian language, and hieroglyph. So for the first time, scholars were able to compare because they already knew how to translate Greek and Demotic. And so now they could compare the hieroglyphs with these 2 languages and figure out what it was saying. The Rosetta Stone, by the way, was discovered in 1799, and the discovery really generated a lot of interest in ancient Egyptian religion because now so many of those ancient texts could finally be translated. We're quite privileged to be living in the current age because we can reap the benefits of a lot of great scholarship on ancient Egypt from the last couple hundred years. Okay, so first we'll talk about the pyramid texts. These were starting to be composed in about the 2300s BC. They are written in hieroglyphics. They're inscriptions on the inside of these pyramids, or more specifically in the burial chamber of the pharaohs, which are located inside the pyramids. Now, these texts don't contain narratives. They consist mostly of spells or incantations, which were written in order to secure the pharaoh's safe journeys and general well-being in the afterlife. These spells were apparently chanted in connection with other rituals and performed as part of the mortuary cult. Here are some photos of the pyramid texts. You can see they're written all around on all the walls and such. And along with these texts, you also see some pictures, some relief sculptures. Here is an image of ancient hieroglyphs, just to give you a sense in case you've not seen those before, which I'm sure you have. Now, I've already read you a little excerpt from the pyramid texts. You remember that text about going to your ka and so on? Well, there are a lot of pyramid texts, so I can't really give you a huge sample here, but just to pick out a few things that might be either interesting or representative of what's written in these texts. Here's one from the Pyramid of Unas, and this text is sometimes referred to by scholars as the Cannibal Hymn. Sky rains, stars darken, the vaults quiver, earth's bones tremble, movements cease at seen Unas rise as a soul or power, a god who lives on his fathers, who feeds on his mothers. Unas is the bull of heaven who rages in his heart, who lives on the essence of every god, who eats their entrails when they come, their bodies full of magic from the Isle of Flame. Unas is the Lord of offerings, who knots the cord, who himself prepares his meal. Unas is he who eats men, feeds on gods, master of messengers, who sends instructions. It is Horn Grasper in Kehau, who lassoes them for Unas. It is Shepherd-raised Head who guards, who holds them for him. It is he upon the willows who binds them for him. It is Khons, the moon, slayer of lords, who cuts their throats for Unas, who tears their entrails out for him, for the envoy who is sent to punish. It is Sheshmu, the winepress god, who carves them up for Unas, cooks meals of them for him in his dinner pots. Unas eats their magic, swallows their spirits. Their big ones are for his morning meal, their middle ones are for his evening meal, their little ones are for his night meal, and the eldest males and females for his fuel. The great ones in the northern sky ignite a fire for him for the contents of the kettles containing the thighs of the elderly. For the sky dwellers serve Unas, and the pots are scraped for him with the legs of their women. He has encompassed the two skies. He has circled the two shores. Unas is the great power that overpowers the powers. Unas is the divine hawk, the great hawk of hawks. Whomever he finds on the road he devours whole. Unas has risen again in heaven. He is crowned as Lord of Lightland, that is the sky. Some translations would say the horizon. He has smashed bones and marrow. He has seized the hearts of gods. He has eaten the red and swallowed the green, that is the crowns of Lower and Upper Egypt. Unas feeds on the lungs of the wise, likes to live on hearts and their magic. Unas delights to have their magic in his belly. The dignities of Unas will not be taken from him, for he has swallowed the knowledge of every god. Unas's lifetime is forever. His limit is eternity in his dignity of if he likes, he does it. If he hates, he does not. As he dwells in light land for all eternity. Behold, their soul or power is in Unas's belly. Their spirits are before Unas as broth of the gods, cooked for Unas from their bones. Behold, their soul or power is with Unas. Their shadows are taken from their owners. For Unas is of those who risen is risen, lasting lasts. Evildoers cannot harm Unas's chosen seat among the living in this land for all eternity. So you understand now why that hymn is called the cannibal hymn. It seems as though the Pharaoh is feasting on the gods, and he does so in order to obtain their knowledge and their essence and their power, their magical power especially. We're not told how exactly a dead Pharaoh would go about eating the gods. Perhaps some small images were placed into the mouth of his corpse, or perhaps human sacrifice was involved. The scribe who wrote this hymn apparently assumed that the reader would understand how to perform the ritual. In any case, the ritual seems to have been discontinued. It's copied in one of the other pyramids, Unas's successor Teti, I believe, but after that, it no longer appears in any of the other pyramids. So perhaps the ritual had become too taboo or too unorthodox for the succeeding pharaohs or priests, and they just chose to discard it. All right, here's another utterance, another one that's found in the pyramid texts of Unas. This is your libation, Osiris. And then libation and 2 pellets of natron. This is like a directive for the priests as to what they're supposed to be doing. This is your libation, O Unas, coming from your son, coming from Horus. I have come, I bring you the eye of Horus, so that your heart may be refreshed by it. I bring it to you to carry you, to be under your souls. Take the efflux which comes out of you, that your heart may not be weary thereby. And then you're supposed to say 4 times, take, the voice has come out for you. Now notice in this text, Unas, the dead pharaoh, is identified implicitly as Osiris. And the new king, his successor, is identified as Horus. So the successor of the pharaoh is apparently involved in this ritual. And he's bringing to him the eye of Horus, which is a complicated idea, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Here are some artifacts, though, depicting the eye of Horus. You can see it's used as an amulet. It was an apoterpaic device, which means it can drive away evil. It can prevent you from being harmed or hurt by something. In the ancient world, the eye was often used as an apoterpaic device like that. So you can see on the right, on this stela, there is actually not just one eye, but 2 eyes. Now these 2 eyes represent the sun and the moon. The sun is on our left, as we face the sculpture, and the moon is on our right. So you could think of the sun and the moon as being the 2 eyeballs of the god Horus that traverse the sky and give us light during the day and during the night. Sometimes, though, there are eclipses, and sometimes the moon becomes dark, or it's a new moon, for example, and this was understood mythologically as the injuring of Horus by his uncle Seth. and we'll get into that myth a little bit later. So here is another utterance from the pyramid texts. O ointment, arise, hurry. You who are on the brow of Horus, arise. First quality cedar oil, hurry. You who are on Horus, you are placed on the brow of this Unus, so that he may feel sweet under you. You grant that this terror be in the eyes of all the spirits when they look at him, and everyone who hears his name. So once again, you can tell that this is some kind of ritual that is being performed at the interment of the dead pharaoh. So all of these utterances are being spoken as spells to protect him and keep him safe in the underworld, to give him a fearful presence so that everybody's going to be afraid of him. One last one from the pyramid texts. Awake in peace, O pure one, in peace. Awake in peace, Horus of the East, in peace. Awake in peace, Soul of the East, in peace. Awake in peace, Horus of Lightland, in peace. All of these spells, telling the pharaoh to awaken so that he can ascend into the skies. You lie down in the night bark. You awake in the day bark. For you are he who gazes on the gods. There is no god who gazes on you. O father of Pepi, Pepi was another pharaoh, take Pepi with you, living. To you, mother Nut. Gates of sky open for Pepi. Fates of heaven open for Pepi. Pepi comes to you. Make him live. Command that this Pepi sit beside you, beside him who rises in Lightland. So this spell was spoken to awaken Pepi, the dead pharaoh, so that he can traverse into the heavens. Okay, moving on now to the coffin texts. The coffin texts date mostly to the Middle Kingdom period. We're talking like about 2000 to 1600 BC. These texts were written on the insides of wooden coffins, which were used for the burial of certain social elites, like priests, accomplished architects, queens, court officials, and so forth. Like the pyramid texts, the coffin texts consist mostly of spells and incantations, but many also contain painted vignettes, which you can see here. Many of the coffin texts deal with the daily transformations or journeys of the sun god Amun-Re, who is Horus. At sunrise, morning, noon, evening, sunset, and especially his dangerous journey through the underworld, which was thought to take place every night. We should also mention the papyri as one of our primary sources. Because Egypt was such a hot and arid place, many papyrus writings have been preserved as well, because in other places there would be rain and dampness in the air, which would contribute to their decomposition. The most famous of these papyrus writings is the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which has actually been preserved in a number of texts and in many different variations. Another important papyrus writing is found in the Chester Beatty I collection, which contains a rendition of the contendings of Horus and Seth, and you're going to be expected to read that. Many other important papyrus works have been preserved as well, but we can't go into everything, of course. This is just a short survey. We can also learn quite a bit about what the Egyptians believed by looking at their religious sculptures, paintings / vignettes, religious paraphernalia, and other artistic works. And the last of our primary sources that we're going to be looking at for studying ancient Egyptian religion are the classical authors. Some of our most helpful sources of information about ancient Egyptian religion don't actually come from Egypt. You see, the ancient Greeks and Romans were quite fascinated with the Egyptians and often wrote about them. So whether we're talking about Herodotus or Plato or Aristotle or some of the playwrights like Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, we can learn quite a bit by listening to the classical authors. One of the most important of these is Plutarch, who was writing about 150 or so AD, I believe. Okay, now getting back to our timeline, there are a couple of historical events that I want you to be aware of, because I think they're quite important. The first is the Hyksos invasion, so-called. In the past, many historians believe that in the 17th century BC, so about 1650 BC, the nation of Egypt was overrun by a foreign people of Semitic descent. Now, the Semites would have been the people of the Levant region, which is this area here. Archaeological evidence now seems to suggest that these Semites were not foreign invaders, but an ethnic group that had been living in Egypt and coexisting with the Egyptians for an unknown number of years until they at last took the reins of power. They never ruled all of Egypt, though. They only ruled parts of the eastern delta region in Avaris and its environs. The pharaohs of the 16th and 17th dynasties continued to rule over the other parts of Egypt. Nevertheless, the Hyksos event was significant since this was the first time that any foreign people had managed to obtain rulership inside of Egypt. Their rule was to be about 100 years. They came to power in about 1650, and by 1550, the pharaoh Ahmose I had driven them out of the land. Now, if you know anything about the book of Exodus in the Bible, some of this will sound rather intriguing. In that book, we're told that the Israelites, a Semitic people, took up residence in Egypt and quickly multiplied. The Egyptians then began to fear that these foreigners were going to take over the country. To prevent that from happening, they of course turned them into slaves. So the Israelites lived as slaves in Egypt for about 400 years until Moses led them out in a miraculous display of God's power. Perhaps when the Israelites began to multiply, the Egyptians recalled what had happened to them under the Hyksos, and this memory prompted them to take preemptive action. Okay, and then I also want you to know about the New Kingdom. This is the kingdom that began with the 18th dynasty with Ahmose I after the Hyksos were driven out of the country. There are a lot of interesting theological developments that happened in the New Kingdom. First, the god Amun was conflated with the sun god Re and would henceforth become known as Amun-Re. Second, I'd like you to know a little bit about Akhenaten. Akhenaten, originally his name was Amenhotep IV. He lived in the mid-14th century. He changed his name to Akhenaten because he wanted to be known as the servant of Aten, which is what Akhenaten means. This pharaoh made some pretty significant theological reforms. He went so far as to suppress the cult of Amun-Re and other gods as well, requiring everyone, at least in some locations, to worship Aten, the sun god or solar disk. Now, you might be asking, wasn't Amun-Re also the sun? Yes, he was. But, different names means different gods. And then a third theological innovation that occurred during the New Kingdom, except not during Akhenaten's reign, of course, was that cultic rituals began to center primarily on the daily rebirth of the sun, as well as the myth of Osiris's death and reconstitution. And we'll talk about that myth a bit later. Okay, so a little bit more here about Akhenaten. Akhenaten is sometimes referred to by modern scholars as the heretic pharaoh because he introduced such radical religious reforms. He's sometimes referred to as the first monotheist because of his special devotion to Aten, the sun disk. As I had just said, he suppressed other cults, and so he clearly had a lot of interest in promoting this worship of Aten. He even changed his name to Akhenaten. But I don't think it's correct to refer to him as a monotheist. He might be better thought of as a henotheist because he didn't deny the existence of the other gods, or even deny that they deserved worship in some other places. Now, in certain places, like at Amarna, and I think Karnak and another place, the rules about who you were supposed to worship and how may have been a little more strict. But then in other parts of the country, people were more or less free to worship whoever they wanted to. Furthermore, Akhenaten saw himself as being a god, and his wife, the queen, was also a goddess. So you at least have, two additional gods besides Aten. But even at Amarna, which was like his religious capital, there were statues and votive offerings that were made to various deities, not just Aten. So here's a quote from Ian Shaw from the Oxford History of Ancient Egypt. It says, even at Amarna itself, there are a fair number of surviving votive objects, stelae, and wall paintings that depict or mention gods such as Bes or Taweret, both connected with childbirth, the harvest goddess Renenutet, the protective deities Isis and Shed, the savior, a new form of Horus not found before Amarna, Thoth, the god of the scribes, Khnum, Satet, and Anuket, the triad of Elephantine, Ptah of Memphis, and even Amun of Thebes, the god whose cult he had supposedly suppressed. Okay, now, by saying this, I'm not trying to downplay the fact that Akhenaten's theological reforms were anything other than revolutionary. They were that. I just don't think that it's right to refer to him as a monotheist. Again, maybe henotheist would be a better term. Or he could just as well be labeled as a polytheist, only of a slightly different variety from the pharaohs who came before and after him. Okay, the second revolutionary aspect of Akhenaten's reign was in the realm of art. As you see in these pictures, the human beings are no longer depicted in ways that are stylized, rigid, intimidating, and so on. Instead, they come off much more human-like. In fact, you might say they come off a bit too human-like. They look out of shape, they have protruding bellies, awkwardly long necks, they've got bad posture, elongated heads, long faces, stringy legs, and so on. The babies look like alien babies. And then, of course, you've got Aten, the solar disk, at the center of a lot of these relief sculptures, with each of the rays of the sun coming down in the form of a hand, which are meant perhaps to symbolize the sun's beneficent or special care for mankind or for the pharaoh and his family. Now here's some art from the Old Kingdom so that you can contrast the art from back then to that which was created during Akhenaten's reign. And you can see it's very different. The statues are much more intimidating. The body postures are much more rigid and straight, very stylized. In other words, they're the same mostly in every picture. Okay, so that's the end of this first lecture. The next lecture, I'm going to get a little bit into the theology and the anthropology of ancient Egypt. By anthropology, I'm talking about the theory of man. What is man? What is the human condition? And so on. And we'll devote a lot of attention to the Egyptians' view of the afterlife, because that was kind of the chief concern of ancient Egyptian religion.